But I think whoever has been in government in the last few years and whoever will be in government in the next few years is going to face some really tough decisions. And politically, it's going to be a pretty challenging time.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And today we're setting the stage for a key moment in UK politics. No, not the upcoming election, but the upcoming spending review. That's going to happen probably straight after the election. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said, I thought rather unhelpfully in his recent budget, that he's setting out the overall budget for the spending envelope for the next several years, but he's not going to tell us how it's going to be allocated until after the election. And that spending review will be an absolutely crucial moment for the next government as it lays out its priorities and plans for public services from 2025 onwards. Now, as we have sort of talked about a few times before on the IFS Zooms In, this spending review will take place against a backdrop of some pretty serious challenges. Obviously, in the long run, we've got the ageing population and the increasing demands on services like the NHS, defence, local government and prisons. But we've also got government debt at nearly 100% of national income and a really tight spending envelope, which we have suggested is likely to mean, if it's kept to, cuts across a range of public services. So, how should the incoming government go about doing the next spending review? Given that it needs to be wrapped up pretty quickly, will there be enough time to do it properly? Or we need to see will there be enough time to do it properly? Will there be an expedited process? Will we get a second spending review to do it properly later next year? How can government make sure they deliver on their priorities? How are they going to manage the trade-offs? Will they be constrained by so-called Treasury orthodoxy? Well, to help us answer these questions, I'm joined by two people who know. They've been at the heart of government. They've seen the process from the inside. David Gauke is a lawyer by background. He served in the Treasury under David Cameron and Theresa May and was Secretary of State for Justice, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions as well. So he's seen it from the Treasury side. He's been on the receiving end too. And also joining us is Giles Wilkes. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Government and a former special advisor to Theresa May and to Vince Cable. And again, has seen this from the inside. I should admit also to having once worked at the Treasury and worked on spending reviews there, as well as being on the receiving side in the Department for Education. So we've all been burned by the spending review process. Welcome, David. Welcome, Giles.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
Good. I hope you still think the same in half an hour. So part of the reason, everybody, that we're doing this podcast now is that we at the IFS have just launched a new tool where you can pretend to be the Chancellor and test how you would fare against some of the fiscal challenges facing the incoming government. You can set out how much you want to spend on different public services, what you want to tax, and see what that does to the deficit and to the debt. And after listening to this episode, you can try your hand at building a budget. See how you would handle the trade-offs that the next Chancellor will face. Search IFS Be the Chancellor to have a go. One of the things that immediately jumps out of the tool is that the next government will inherit a really tight set of spending plans. The current government has penciled in that total spending will grow by just 1% per year over the next 5 years. Now, that might not sound too bad. That is at least an increase. But we also know that areas like the NHS and defence will be protected and will grow more quickly than that. And because particularly the NHS is so big, that would inevitably mean big cuts to most other departments. So when the next government comes to power, they'll have to set not only spending total, but exactly how that will be split between different areas, and if there are cuts, where they'll fall. And as I said earlier, the Chancellor has quite explicitly said he's not going to tell us before the election because the spending review will be after the election. So, David, Giles, you've both been there on the inside of the spending review process. Let's start with the basics. David, I mean, you were even Chief Secretary, so you were the man absolutely in charge of this. What is a spending review?
So a spending review is the point at which the government not only sets out the overall aggregate level of departmental spending, but it sets out the cash limits by department, usually over a multi-year period. It doesn't always have to be. You can have a one-year spending review, but it's usually over a multi-year period. And the thinking behind it is that that gives departments much greater certainty. But it's not just about plucking a number up and saying, right, here you are, department, this is what we've agreed to. That is the point where the Treasury and the relevant spending department sort of sit down and work out what are their priorities, what is it they're going to spend, how are they going to spend their within their cash limits. What are they going to do? What are they not going to do? It essentially is the moment where a department, at least if a spending review is done well, this is when the sort of department works out its strategy over that time period.
And what comes first, the chicken or the egg, in the sense of does the Treasury start with, here is the total, and we're going to find a way of divvying that up? Or is there at least a little bit more of a bottom-up process where you could be persuaded to spend a little bit more?
To some extent, it depends, but I think recent history is more that it was, and certainly my time in government, it was more of a kind of top-down, this is where we need to get to, because, after 2010, there was a sort of, it was very much about how do we reassure the markets, how do we show that we're heading in a particular direction. So you start off with the aggregate level, and then, how the department's going to enable us to get to the final total where we want to. Now, of course, still within an individual department, you might say, well, look, I want to do more of this, in which case the Treasurer will say, well, you've got to find that from your allocated resources, and you've got to reprioritize. So if you want to do more of X, you'll have to do less of Y, and you, the department, will have to do it. And come up with the plans, and of course it's a period, it's a series of negotiations and haggling and what have you, and departments will try and get the number up a bit, and the Treasurer will try and get the number down a bit. But it's not just, I think the thing I would stress is not just about the numbers. It's if a department is taking it seriously, this is where they have to make the hard choices of what really matters to them and what doesn't.
Your experience of this, Giles?
Yeah. Yes. Well, David's right there. I mean, the spending review that really defines the experience for me is the 2010 one, which is arguably the hardest spending review that a government has had to do in living memory. Spending reviews only really began in this form around 1998. It seems remarkable to say so, but it used to be much more ad hoc. The Treasury would say each year what you're going to get, and if you want any more long-term certainty, you just have to rely on sort of political faith. It was only around 1998 they started setting out 2 or 3 year periods. But in 2010, the dominant fact coming in was, to quote that infamous letter, there is no more money. And in fact, there was a 148 or something billion pound deficit. And the priority, I mean, the one that comes first in your chicken and egg question was the deficit needs to be down to a certain level in the final year of this parliament. And so it was absolutely explicitly answered, that question. There was a June emergency budget which set out all of the total managed expenditure levels and reasonable guesses for the various components of that, the annual managed expenditure versus the allocated amounts for departments. And then we were told, you've got to make this fit. And that order of priority defined the whole of that coalition, because to get that envelope larger, since we couldn't increase borrowing because the coalition was kind of defined around that reducing borrowing mission, tax would have to rise, but both sides of the coalition wanted to keep tax falling. The Lib Dems went in with this big commitment to raise the income tax threshold, and therefore there wasn't much there. So spending had to take all of the strain. And then when you take into account the ring fences and the harder political things like the NHS budget, the foreign aid budget, the fact that you can't really cut the defence budget very hard, the devolved budgets are pretty hard. All of the pressure, this is where I start sounding very aggrieved. All of the pressure comes on what were called the unprotected departments. So from the sort of 320 billion, if memory serves, that were going to various departments, I reckon only about 120 had to do all of the really, really hard thinking about how it was going to be allocated. And the problem jumping ahead, no doubt, a little bit to certain sort of problems with the way this happens. Suppose that overall total, suppose tax falls, and you still need to make the same deficit numbers. So spending has to take more of the strain. All of that strain cascades down in a highly geared way onto these unprotected departments. So the business department had to take a 20%. I think the unallocated, the unprotected departments had to take 20%, in some cases 30 or 40%. Not because somebody had worked out from the bottom up that for the various needs they service, the science, the further education, higher education, they needed 20% less, but because that was the only way to make the maths add up. So what if that wasn't enough money? Well, we find out later.
Yeah, and that's that is part of the job here of a spending review is there's a giant spreadsheet. As you both said, the history of this is there is a firm cap on the total, and once you've given the NHS some money, which is 40% of the total here, and once you've decided you can't cut defence and so on, you're really just kind of trying to make everything else add up. And the result, as Giles has said, was over the 2010s, really big cuts in justice, industry, environment, local government, the things that weren't firmly protected. And of course, that's going to be a risk. That's going to be a risk next time round.
Yeah, there's also a point, which is even when you take all of that on board, a department takes all those sort of cuts and says, right, okay, this is how we're going to do it. These are our priorities. What if it turns out that some of the things that in fact weren't priorities are in fact politically very difficult to cut? And you take an example of justice, which was, I subsequently became Justice Secretary, but Ken Clarke came forward with a series of proposals for justice in order to make the numbers add up, but also he was felt it was the right thing to do, which was essentially a more liberal approach.
Fewer people in prison,
and imprisoning people is very, very expensive, and actually you can make the numbers add up, and that's all very sustainable. You then run into the difficulty is that nobody else in government, sadly, I think, was supportive of Ken Clarke's agenda, in which case you've got the very difficult numbers for the MOJ, but you haven't got the policies that might possibly deliver those numbers. And then you've got an even bigger problem. And so it's one of the reasons why the MOJ has had such a hard time is that they took a sort of set of cuts on the assumption that certain policies were going to be pursued, but collectively the government decided that in fact we weren't going to pursue those policies after all. And then you've got a real...
Well, then you've got the worst of all worlds. You've kind of agreed to a budget cut on the basis that you're going to do less, and then you're not allowed to do less,
yes.
And then you have all of the problems that we've to some extent had with the justice system over quite a long period of time now. I mean, in your experience, so you've got this spreadsheet, you've got to make the numbers add up. Now, my experience of working in the Department of Education in the 2000s was that a spending review was an enormous sort of programme of work within a department as we tried to make the case to the Treasury for all of the reasons why education spending here and there and so on was terribly valuable. Now, this was in a different world in which there was money around in the 2000s, but my impression is the same. The department put lots and lots of work into trying to persuade the Treasury that they should get the more money, or at least they should be cut by less than other people. How much difference does all that work make in the end, or is in the end this a kind of combination of a very high level political decision layered on top of a spreadsheet?
I think more often than not, it's high level political decisions. And I mean, I can remember an occasion where I just happened to be, it wasn't my area of responsibility, but I just happened to be in the room when a decision was made on Home Office expenditure. And it turned out that there was a little bit more money. As often happens when you get to the end of this process, there's a little bit more money available than you once thought. And George Osborne said, well, actually, policing, it seems to be an issue. Actually, they can have a bit more. And that was a sort of an unusual one, which was essentially the Treasury went back to the Home Office and gave them a bit more on the policing budget than they were asking for, because it just so happened to be we've got a bit of money. What should we do with it? This is quite a good cause. And I don't know whether Theresa May ever thanked George Osborne for it. I suspect probably not.
When she sacked him.
It wasn't effusive.
It wasn't effusive, no, quite. So it can sometimes work the other way, but more often than not, it is coming back to the Chancellor, the Chief Secretary. We've got to make all the spreadsheet numbers sort of add up. Now, one would hope, and there is an element of this. If you come forward with a sort of really good plan and say, actually, this seems to be convincing, this is evidence based, I would say, curiously, I was a spending minister within the Treasury for quite a while because I had responsibility for HMRC, and actually, we were able to persuade the Treasury that, if you go and cut this, you're going to lose revenue. And actually, we want to have resources to deploy in this particular area that will bring more money in. And it was listened to, not as much as you would like. You didn't get everything, but there was a certain amount of sort of responsiveness. Because ideally we'd have more of this. But if departments can make a convincing case that they are going to either reduce future demands on public services, or improve productivity, or in the case of HMRC, bring additional tax revenue in, the Treasury is not going to sort of ignore those arguments. But, the Treasury is also conscious that lots of departments make spend to save proposals, and more often than not, there is the spending and there's not the saving, and they become a bit jaundiced about it. So departments don't always win these arguments. In fact, they usually lose them, but sometimes they'll win one against their head.
I think that's a great description of what goes on, and also a great description of what annoys people about the Treasury, in the sense that everyone has their own priority for their own area, and Treasury very often just has to say no, and it obviously gives Treasury a rather bad reputation, particularly when people really believe, often on the basis of some decent evidence, that spending now will save money in the future. You started off there, David. I thought if there's any sort of civil servants in spending departments listening, they're going to be getting very depressed at this point, because you're telling them all this work they do in their spending reviews in the end doesn't have much impact. But then you let them down a little bit more gently at the end, saying it just might if you do it really, really well, and you're really, really convincing.
Don't give up all hope, but don't guarantee. Don't assume it'll work. Yeah.
And Giles, from your point of view in the spending department, I mean, presumably, you were you were on the sort of political end as a special advisor, so you were sort of doing a combination of trying to run the politics with the centre of government, but also ensuring the department had the best case it could have.
Yes, I mean, the problem for me, and it's difficult to remember, because there's so much tactics and game playing in spending reviews. What I found most dismaying, and some of it would be specific to that situation, was clearly the Treasury has to anticipate the idea that the departments are going to do what's called shroud waving. In other words, if you cut this thing here, there'll be the other phrase was bleeding stumps. There'll be say we're all
10% of our budget. We'll shut all the schools.
Yes, exactly. We'll be forced to do this, and there's another well-known economic concept, the moral hazard. So somebody will offer to cut a thing that they know that you cannot politically bear to, knowing full well that the Treasury, with its secret pocket of reserves for the last-minute emergency, will come in and rescue that one. So with this amount of game playing going on, there's a lot of distrust between the parties. It's a bilateral conversation with asymmetric information. The departments want to get, obviously, large enough budgets, but they also want to hide the underspends. In other words, if they want to be able to ask for slightly more money, and if they do have more money, they want to use that for the other pressures themselves. The Treasury wants to scoop together all of these underspends for the Chancellor's big moments that seem to happen 2 or 3 times a year to fund some kind of a tax cut. So as a result, even if really good work is going on, my concern is that the incentives are often not to proceed in good faith. Another great phrase that people will be using in there is called tucking under, where you find something I think this is the phrase, where something is protected, like overseas development aid. So the Treasury will try to define something as contributing towards the overseas development budget. They say, well, this funny thing you're doing here, but it happens to involve this African country. We're going to redefine it so that it contributes towards that, and then we don't have to give as much money formally to that. So lots of these different kind of games go on. So even if there is really good diligent analysis suggesting there's going to be great invest to save ideas, or great ideas that are going to boost economic growth, everybody knows that it's going to have to pass through this sort of matrix of sort of tactics, which the civil servants are often very good at, and the politicians are desperate to be informed about because they've never done one before. And then finally, to use another of my phrases that isn't a civil service one, but myself, it gets punted up what I call the pyramid of indifference, which is the higher you go up the political system, not wishing to be rude to extremely important former politicians, but the higher up they go, the more general their knowledge is, the more that they're very connected to the voter who only cares about 3 or 4 really big things, tax, spend, security, issues like Partygate. And the more likely the politician will hear about the lower level spending dispute and say, I just don't care, resolve it. And will just, so you know that if you allow it to go too far, you might be treated brutally. So you have to settle quite early. Otherwise, you might be subject to the blink test of a prime minister or his advisors or her advisors. And as a result, just not get the due consideration. So it doesn't matter that you've done fantastic cost-benefit analysis. If at the end of it he says, this doesn't sound like an issue I care about, it's the officials getting head up about nothing, cut it. So you want to make sure that you don't get put into the final calculations, because the final calculations can be really bloody.
Yeah, there's also a point about the political capital that individual departments have, which varies.
Yeah.
So if you're at health, you have got one of those issues that the public really cares about, and you can present, it's all going to be terrible, and you can see the prime minister, you can immediately see the sort of political costs. If you're at justice, where for the most part, unless you have got a crisis underway at that precise moment, the public aren't that engaged, in which case you've got very little political leverage. And it seems to me that if you are a spending minister, the tactics you can use, the tools that you've got are available, really depends on the political situation and the political salience of the issue. So I always felt when I was at Justice that the way for me to work with the Treasury was to be something of sort of teacher's pet, which was not necessarily to play sort of loads of games, because basically, the Treasury knew me quite well and saw me as sort of one of theirs, really, is to try and say, well, actually, we do have a genuine problem here, and we are prepared to make some tough decisions, and we are being very open with you, and, there's a moral hazard point, shouldn't we be rewarded? And actually, we got a little bit of progress there. If I try to go out and sort of play prisoners' food is terrible, or actually prison conditions generally is awful, unless you can completely convince the Treasury that the whole system is about to collapse unless you get more money, they're unlikely to sort of go with it. And so you have to genuinely be able to say, to be fair, Liz Truss, when she was Justice Secretary and I was Chief Secretary, got some money out of the Treasury for more prison officers because she made a convincing case that the whole system was about to collapse. And she was right. She was right. No, I think she was absolutely right about that. But it wasn't a sort of public campaign that you might do, for your health, if you're defence, you sort of wheel out a few old generals. There's all sorts of things that you can.
You get that every time, don't you? You always get these old generals at spending review time saying how much they need more money,
and it plays very well with Conservative constituency parties as well. So there are different techniques in different departments to win the political battles, as well as the sort of the genuine hard work that is done by officials to try to make a convincing case. It is politics as much as anything else.
I guess if any of our listeners were still labouring under the naive belief that there was a rational basis on which we're governed and money is allocated, I think they've probably been well and truly disabused of that notion in the last 5 minutes. The sort of combination of of what Giles has called the political game playing, this pyramid of indifference, which is definitely a phrase I'm going to remember. It's not one I've come across before, but I recognise it exactly. I think it's true in many organisations, actually. If you push a decision up too far, then if it's not on the Prime Minister's horizon or the Chief Executive's horizon, they'll just sort of bat it away, and that can be really quite dangerous. So we have the sort of form of a spending review where there is all of this work going on, cost-benefit analyses and what the value of this and that is. And then you've got the sort of political reality, which is in the end, pretty high level decisions are taken. I'd like to come back to some of that in a minute. In particular, I'm interested in this question of how much, say, the Treasury has over what goes on within departments once they've given them a block of money. But before we do that, let's come to this question of what's going to happen after the election. Suppose we have an election in, let's say, November. We have to have some kind of spending review to allocate money from April 2025. So there's not going to be an awful lot. It's not going to be an awful lot of time. So what are your views, the two of you, on how that should happen? Should this be a traditional 3-year or 5-year spending review done very quickly? Should the new government be looking to do something interim for a year and then do a great big spending review for the rest of the Parliament? They just roll everything forward. I mean, what's your views about how this should happen in the end of this year, the first month of next year?
My instant thought is they should roll over at first. But I mean, the new government, assuming it is a new government, which is what the polls seem to suggest, will have a very limited window of sort of political capital and understanding amongst the voters to say we've encountered a really big mess. It means a couple of things. One, things are going to be pretty bad before they get good again. Two, we're going to have to do some really difficult things, including stuff that we maybe weren't able to lay out to you fully during the election campaign. And I think they will have a year of understanding to take a breath and to look at how they're going to construct that bargain with the voters. And if they're forced to try to reach sort of quite detailed totals going out several years, they will feel sort of ambushed. And they won't get a chance to change the way things are done, which this conversation might come on to later. And I think that would be awfully difficult for them. So I think it would strain a new administration too much to make really, really hard commitments to its departmental spending totals, given it will be such a short amount of time, given, November, then Christmas, then there's a budget coming up in March. I just think that's not very much time for people to get their feet under the desk and understand their departments.
So no long-term decisions quickly.
Not immediately.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you can make a case against it. Does it look as if they're indecisive? Are they unprepared for it? But the reality is, until you are in office, until you have got access to the civil servants, unless you can, properly examine all the different priorities, any spending review that is done between November and March, and look, even if you did it in March, it's not giving departments very much notice exactly, is it, what their budget's going to be for the sort of following year. But any kind of spending review there I think it's very likely that if that happens, a year or two down the line, you'll have ministers going, I wish I'd known about this. I wish I'd given more thought to this particular issue. And I was thinking, we're actually, knowing now what I know, if I knew then what I know now, I would have spent more on this and less on that. So I think, take a step back. And although, Giles and I have been a little bit sort of cynical about the sort of process, it is still an important point in terms of setting the direction for a department about, what are its priorities? What is it really trying to do? And if you want to be a transformative government, and every government wants to be a transformative government, just being able to sort of take a step back, really understand the department, understand the sort of technological opportunities, for example. So this is something that all parties are really interested in. Where is AI going to come in? And so that you just need to take a little bit of time to work out what the opportunities are and how you're going to deliver it. So, roll over for a year and then come back and make your big decisions, big strategic decisions. It's still relatively early in the Parliament. So I agree with Giles. I think that's the route forward.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, there's two issues that immediately come to mind. One is you're potentially going to have an electorate which is, with all due respect, David, fed up with 14 years of this government and wants a change. And you're saying, well, we'll think about it, which you can see why that might not be attractive. The other is what do we mean even here by rolling forward, given what I set out right at the beginning, the arithmetic of the current spending envelope, as it's called, would imply some cuts in that first year. I mean, do you think there's a way of avoiding that and still keeping to promises of fiscal caution?
I mean, if they can find if they can find some sort of short-term sources of revenue, or if they're lucky and the economy does a bit better than is currently projected,
which it might.
It's not by no means impossible. In which case you could put in some additional short-term funding that maybe to sort of soften the blow. You might also say, well, we are essentially sticking to the Tory plans, and this is what was implied, and this is what they were doing. So to some extent, you sort of say, yes, they're cuts, but they're Tory cuts, even though it's a Labour government. Now, whether that works politically, one can question, but that might just give them, a new government might just be able to get away with, well, it's difficult, but it's going to take us some time, and we're working away at a long-term economic plan, to coin a phrase, and we're going to announce that in due course. I mean, but look, all the options are difficult.
Yeah, it's inevitably political at this point. We'd have to be suggesting something that has political impact, which I know you deplore politics in these hallowed walls. But I would say, first, it's absolutely clear there's not enough money. If you say the 2021 spending review 3 years ago was enough money, since then it was decided almost at the moment inflation picked up. And since then, we've had the price level rise, 10, 12% above what we expect. So that suggests we're lacking several tens of billions of pounds. So number one, your premise is absolutely correct. I would say number two, as for David's idea of finding revenues, this is a political advice, and I've got notoriously bad at giving this, but I would say this government has announced quite a few tax cuts, and I would say we supported them. But we now, having looked at the books, we need to phase them in. The story they need to tell is that things will be fixed by 2028, 29. But these tax cuts were not affordable in the next 2 or 3 years' time, and therefore, with great regret, we have to delay them until 27, 28. And that would be the thing.
Tax cuts are already here. That's the
well, yeah, these NICS cuts and so forth. And I don't, having never worked with the HMRC, I've no idea how ugly that looks to sort of bait and switch the voter. As David said, nothing is easy right now. But I think every time there's a fiscal moment, the Labour strategists are gnashing their teeth because they're making the next spending period more and more unaffordable every time the government announces further revenue cuts that eats away at that headroom. And I think the most honest thing to say is that is what we discovered after the election.
Well, I don't think that will. Well, I have to say, if the new government says that, I'm going to be very rude because that's not honest.
Right.
They know exactly what the position is. They know exactly how hard it is. So if on Rachel Reeves's first budget, she says something like, look, I know we said this in our manifesto, but we open the books and it looks much worse. I will be on telly immediately saying, you knew exactly how bad it was. There is nothing that isn't transparent about what a nightmare this is.
Well, and the existence of the ABR, of course, the IFS is the oracle here, but we've also got the ABR. So I think in a way it's going to become harder for governments in future to do we've opened the books, because the books to some extent are already open. It's an interesting point about national insurance contributions, which is, of course, you can change those instantly. Income tax, you have to wait until April. So, if Jeremy Hunt, for example, does another fiscal event in the autumn and announces income tax cuts, it's quite easy for Rachel Reeves to say, well, we'll bring those in a year later. If it's NICS cuts, which I think is clearly more likely, they can happen sort of overnight or very nearly overnight. You can bring them in very quickly. They don't have to wait till the end of the year because NICS don't work on that way.
And Paul, would your fury be the same if it was some other tax, some sort of stealth tax like Gordon Brown announced on pension dividends in 1997, or if something else helped to make the books go up? Would you say, well, fair enough? Or
no, I think it would just be the statement, we opened the books and discovered we needed to do something that would annoy me because the books are open.
Okay.
If depending on what's in the manifestos and so on, if Labour come in and say, look, our manifesto didn't say anything about this, but it's only now that we realise we need to do it, I think that would irritate me. If, on the other hand, they say, look, there was nothing in our manifesto about this, and we've had to do it, and sorry we didn't tell you, well,
yeah,
fine, up to a point. I'd like it if both parties were honest about this. I'd like it in some ways if Jeremy Hunt were to lay out, look, here's my envelope, and here's what my spending review will look like if I win the next election. And I'd like it if Labour were to do the same. But they're clearly neither of them going to, because I'm a naive economist who's taking no notice of the politics here, in which I think we're not going to get a great deal of honesty about these really hard trade-offs. And that's the position that the new government, is, whoever they are, is going to be in, which is that they're either going to have to accept more borrowing or more tax, or there will be some spending cuts, or some combination of the three. But of course, David, you entered government in 2010, and you had a sort of within-year spending review straight away, didn't you?
We did, which, look, in normal circumstances is far from ideal, because departments, like to be able to plan, and if you're just looking for where the sort of spare change is in year, it's very difficult. I would defend it in the particular circumstances, because I think we needed to send a very clear signal to the markets of our determination, and actually, resources were found in year. It was doable, and it set a sort of different direction. I would say I think it contributed to market credibility, but it's not an ideal situation. For Giles was talking about earlier about the history of spending reviews, and the reason why Gordon Brown brought them in is to give that certainty and stability to whoever it might be, not just departments, but as it percolates down, whether it's to the head teacher or the hospital manager or the police constable, chief constable, whatever it might be. Here's your budget, and you can crack on and plan on that basis. So in-year cuts, makes that harder.
We're talking about all of this in terms of if there really are constraints, and the constraint is set by the amount that the Treasury is happy to borrow. There we have fiscal rules, and actually Rachel Reeves has essentially said she'll sign up to the same fiscal rules as Jeremy Hunt is looking at. Presumably, right through your time in Treasury, David, these fiscal rules really bit. You were having to you set your own rules, but then they bite. Were there times where you thought, actually, this is just slightly crazy Treasury orthodoxy? We could be borrowing more, given what's happening to the public services, and to what? But also, what was your? It seems to me, sitting outside, the fiscal rules play all sorts of different roles, even though they're often broken and so on. But probably their most important, I sense, or one of their most important, is actually in this within government game, where you're saying to departments, "We can't do it. Look, here's our rules. You signed up to those. There isn't any space there." So there is the point. Rules kind of provide a bit of transparency. They reassure the markets. But the reality is the most important thing is actually they just make the Treasury more powerful within government.
That's certainly true. And if you're sat at the sort of Treasury side of the table, you'll be presented, as we were talking earlier, about I've got these spend to save ideas, and this is there's lots of nice things that we could spend money on, and the fact is there are lots of good ways of spending taxpayers' money. There are lots of areas of public expenditure that would all be very nice, but we can't do them all, and you have to draw a line. And what the fiscal rules enables the Treasury to do is to draw that line and draw it in such a way that you can apply it to the sort of individual conversations you were having with the Secretary of State and saying, "Oh, we've calculated all of this, and we've got fiscal rules, and we as a government have signed up to these fiscal rules, and as it applies to your department, this is what it means." And if you took the fiscal rules away, then the balance of negotiation, the balance of power within that negotiation would have shifted pretty fundamentally. And I have to say, before it, I think it would be anarchy.
Yeah, that's. To give a plug for the other think tank, Institute for Government, where I work a couple of days a week, we did a big report on the Treasury orthodoxy, and we're often confronted with this fact that there's something called the common pool problem. There's a finite amount of resource and everybody's dipping their hands into it and everybody's got an incentive to get as much as they can from it. And only one party to this whole negotiation has an incentive to stop the pool exploding outwards, and that's the Treasury. So the Treasury is mentally confronting 2025 quite powerful political actors on the other side of the table. So, of course, it has to take this sort of quite robust attitude that there is an absolutely firm limit, and it's exogenous to the argument. You can't allow any one of those other parties to say, oh, by the way, why don't you just put a penny on income tax and fund my thing? Because suddenly everybody would be just expanding the pool of resources. And it sounds extremely crude until you realise that some governments have not even had that much control before, and things really do spiral out of control. And the Treasury would say, you accuse us of being too powerful. Can I show you a chart of the public debt to GDP ratio? What would too weak look like?
That's a fair point. Because of course, part of the reason we're having this conversation is that debt is knocking on for 100% of national income.
Yeah,
and it's not going down anytime soon. I mean, even on the incredibly tight spending plans the Chancellor has set out, debt is still rising over the next couple of years, and then at best flattening out at around 100% of national income.
And some of this is about growth. I mean, it's the debt to GDP ratio we most frequently refer to. And back when I started thinking about all of this stuff in 2008, 9, 10, you assumed that the cash size of the economy would grow 5.5% every year. And now 3.5% would be pretty good. And right now it might be 3%. And when that ratio doesn't rise a lot, those are the resources to generate the taxes to pay for everything. So getting growth going again would make all of these issues easier.
So would lower interest rates, wouldn't they? I mean,
yes.
It is. I mean, one of the things that has absolutely, takes my breath away when I look at some of these charts is the extent to which we are now spending so much on servicing our national debt. I think it was over 100 billion last year. It's come down as inflation has come down this year, but it's something like 70 or 80 billion pounds on that, which is more than on any public service other than the National Health Service.
Well, just the increase is more than we spend on almost every public service.
Yeah, just the increase in the debt, and part of the problem, and one of the reasons that I think it's going to be a difficult few years is, in order to stop the debt continuing to increase, we actually need to bring in more in taxes and other revenues than we spend on everything other than servicing that debt, which is not a position we've been in for a very, very long time. So I wouldn't say this is going to be a good election to lose, but it's certainly going to be difficult for the next lot in.
Yeah, and the demographic pressures, of course, increasing, the cost of decarbonisation, and we've talked a little bit on some of the defence pressures. When you look at this, whoever is in government, and look, I'm not here to defend my old party, but I think whoever has been in government in the last few years and whoever will be in government in the next few years is going to face some really tough decisions, and politically it's going to be a pretty challenging time.
One thing I did want to explore, a couple of things I want to explore before we end. I mean, one was this issue I mentioned towards the start of the podcast, which is spending review is a set piece moment in which the Treasury allocates money to all these departments. But often it will also say within that, we'd like you to spend this much on schools and this much on further education and this much on early years and so on, if they're talking to the Department for Education, or if they're talking to the Home Office, this much on various aspects of what you do. To what extent, in your experience, does any of that actually then play out, or does the Treasury then exercise control over how the money is spent, or effectively is that then fully devolved to the departments that it's sent to?
I've been trying to investigate this, and one of the frustrating things with only having sort of short spells in government, in my case 4 years, then 2.5, you don't get to follow through. A lot of things you start, you then maybe revisit 5 or 10 years later on Google. You don't get to see it. I've heard frustrations from some of the people I interviewed for the Treasury piece that the Treasury would be a very sort of powerful finance-dominated department, but wasn't brilliant at accountancy in the sense of like chasing up the money was spent where it was promised. And certain spending ministers would be very frustrated. They thought they had money allocated to this, and then it would go off to that instead. As far as I can see formally, formally what happens with government money is there's just a 1-year voting process, something called the Spending and Appropriations Bill that goes through every year. And that's the only thing that actually exists legally. And that just has really high level totals. So in theory, everything below there is a kind of a political agreement. And political agreements are often very hard to break, but it's not like the money comes labelled through. So I think there's considerable scope for ministers who've got enough clout to be able to say, now this is my money. I want to spend it how I like, and circumstances change, and so you want me to be a little bit flexible. But I'm still investigating quite the degree to which things do remain really hard within departments.
Well, David was on both sides of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, the fact that I was Chief Secretary to the Treasury for a year, and it was in fact, it was the year in which I had to work hardest. The workload for Chief Secretary, it does suggest that it's not as if there was no spending review in that year period. So it's not as if, once the Treasury is done, it sort of steps back completely and, the departments kind of get on with it. But the reality is lots of departments will then run into problems. They will find that, the money isn't enough, that something turns out to be more expensive, that they can't deliver the cuts that they want to do, and that they're having to come back to the Treasury. And to the extent to which the Treasury intervenes in other departments largely reflects whether the department itself is simply able to sort of stick to the plan or not. And very often they can't for whatever reason, whether failures at the departmental level, whether there was failures in the original process, the original spending review agreement. But one way or the other, the Treasury is still going to be back involved, because departments are very often coming up with, we're going to go over budget, we're going to need in-year support, and it doesn't depend upon the size. I mean, I spent much more time dealing with the MOJ as Chief Secretary to the Treasury than one would expect to, given it's a relatively small spending department, but because it had more issues, more difficulties, and so the Treasury will remain involved with the problem pupils, if you like.
It's very interesting you say that year as Chief Secretary was the hardest working year. I mean, I was in the Treasury in the 2000s when the Chief Secretary seemed to sort of turn over really quite frequently, and I have to say there was big variations in work rate between the different individuals in that post. So you were a good guy.
Well, part of the problem is as Chief Secretary is that you would kind of go in to have a meeting with the Secretary of State, and for the Secretary of State, they're talking about their department, and it's a really important meeting, and for you, it's just one of the 20 or so departments you're dealing with, and it's
you see, I went in with Chief Secretaries, some of whom were really well prepared for that, and obviously put a lot of work, and others who frankly blustered and did the politics, but didn't have a clue what they were talking about.
Well, you're really exposed as a Chief Secretary if you do that.
So we probably ought to wrap this up. Look, okay. So assume we're going to get a new government. I mean, what is? I mean, you've experienced this, David. What would you be saying to your, the current Shadow Chief Secretary, Shadow Chancellor? They're going in. They take over, say in December. What's your advice to them about how they go about the next spending review?
I think it's all about prioritisation. It's all about working out what you want the government to do, and it's also a terrific role, by the way. Being Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Chancellor, I'm sure, is even better. But you have got.
I think that bird has flown, David.
I know. Well, at least I can play on your thing on your website. So there you go. That's my chance. But you can. You can influence what those sort of priorities are, but kind of absolutely work out where you want to be in 5 years' time. What are the achievements that you want to make, and use it to shape the state as you think right. And that's why I think you need a bit more time. I don't think you can rush through this and have it done by April 25. That I think is a tremendous privilege, and so sort of at one level I'm very envious of them to be able to do that.
I guess I've got two. I mean, this has been quite bleak. I've loved it, but it's been quite bleak. And I would say there are two areas where I think
Giles
things could be
bleak.
improved. I do love bleak. That's where economists and their dismal ways come in. I would say there are two areas where I could become more optimistic. One, I think a lot of the invest to save ideas and the revenue raising ideas that can be politically acceptable work if you are devolved. If you have a more devolved tax system, the people who are spending money or raising money for a particular end that is acceptable to voters can make that case, because the benefits are sort of held locally as well. And so I think that if they can spend the next 5 years moving to a system where more revenue is raised locally and more spend to save ideas like prevention spending that then see its dividend through lower calls on the emergency system, then that is a reason to think we might be going to a better place. The other one would be a sheer preference because of the order in which we've been doing things, which is first the deficit, then the tax, then the ring-fenced departments, and then finally the smaller ones. The next substantial spending review starts with the smallest departments. Start with the really small ones where £1 billion can make an absolutely gigantic difference, because those conversations have been neglected for 15 years because of the order of priority. The stories that move me the most when I'm reading in sort of more detailed periodicals like The Economist about things going wrong are areas like MOJ, where you think, but for £1 billion, that might make the huge difference to the prison estate, to the reoffending rate, to all sorts of things that we really ought to care more. And because of the order of priority, they get the prime ministerial attention and the Treasury attention last. So for this spending review, maybe not structurally, but for this one, I'd love it if they start with the small ones, because those budgets can't be decided by a process of elimination anymore. I think that's crazy.
That's great advice, and I think this, and if people use our "Be the Chancellor" tool, they'll see these relative sizes that anything you do, 10% on the National Health Service blows your whole budget for absolutely everything else. Whereas 10% for the Ministry of Justice makes almost no difference to anything else, but might make a big difference to the Ministry of Justice. And I think that's really. That's really good advice. So thank you, Giles, so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. And if you've listened and want to try your hand at being the Chancellor, just use our new tool. It lets you set departmental spending plans, adjust taxes and benefit spending, change assumptions around economic growth and interest rates, and see how all of that will impact the borrowing and the deficit. To have a go, search IFS Be the Chancellor or go to our website, www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. See you next time.